While some planes dominated entire armies in World War II, there were some that killed its own men. Today, we're not talking about the Spitfires, not the Mustangs, not the Legends. We're talking about the other planes, the ones that commanders quietly stopped ordering, the ones where the pilots drew straws to see who'd fly them, the ones where the biggest danger wasn't enemy flak. It was the aircraft itself. These are the worst planes of World War II, and the stories of the men who flew them and didn't come back.
1. The Brewster Buffalo. Let's start in the Pacific, 1941, the skies over Malaya and the Dutch East Indies. The pilots who climbed into the Brewster F-2A Buffalo thought they were getting a modern fighter. The Americans had designed it with confidence. It looked stocky, barrel-chested almost, stubby, but on paper, the specs seemed respectable. In reality, it was a flying coffin. When the Japanese Zero appeared in the same skies, the contrast was brutal. The Zero was nimble, fast, and devastatingly well-armed. The Buffalo was heavy, slow to climb, and about as maneuverable as a milk truck. Finnish pilots, who were among the best in the world, actually made it work on the Eastern Front against Soviet aircraft. But let's be clear, that says everything about the Finnish pilots and nothing about the plane. For everyone else, it was a massacre. British and Commonwealth pilots flying Buffaloes against the Japanese over Malaya lost aircraft at a horrifying rate. The plane's engine had a habit of overheating at the worst possible moments. The landing gear was fragile. It had a nasty reputation for collapsing on rough airstrips, which, in the Pacific, was basically every airstrip. And its rate of climb, so poor that by the time a Buffalo pilot saw a Zero diving on him from above, it was already too late to respond. One British pilot described flying the Buffalo as being asked to fight with one hand tied behind your back, blindfolded, in someone else's shoes. The Americans replaced it with the Wildcat, then the Hellcat, then the Corsair. The Buffalo was quietly retired, but not before it cost hundreds of pilots their lives. And the Buffalo wasn't even close to being the worst.
2. The Blackburn Botha. Now we cross to Britain. 1939. The Royal Air Force is preparing for war, and they need a coastal patrol and torpedo bomber. They commissioned the Blackburn Botha. On paper, it's a twin-engine patrol aircraft. It should handle long overwater missions, carry a torpedo, defend itself with gun positions. In practice, it was a disaster from the first flight. The Botha was critically underpowered. Its two Perseus engines simply couldn't produce enough thrust to carry the plane's full load and climb adequately. Pilots reported that fully loaded, the Botha could barely maintain height. If one engine failed, which they did regularly, the plane had almost no ability to fly on the remaining engine alone. But here's what made it genuinely deadly. The design of the cruise stations meant that the pilot had severely restricted visibility. The gun positions were awkward and difficult to operate, and the aircraft had handling characteristics that veterans described as treacherous, particularly around low speeds during takeoff and landing. Training accidents in the Botha were so frequent, so relentless, that it earned a grim nickname among RAF crews. They called it the Killer, not because of what it did to the enemy, because of what it did to its own pilots. The RAF pulled it from frontline operations almost immediately and shunted it into training roles, where, ironically, it continued to kill the men learning to fly it. Over 100 aircrew died in both the accidents, most of them young men who never even saw combat. It was eventually withdrawn entirely, an embarrassment that the RAF tried to quietly forget.
3. The Fairey Battle. The Battle was a light bomber that had been in service since 1937. It was already outdated by 1940, but there was nothing immediately available to replace it. It was slow, with a top speed of around 240 miles per hour. It carried a single rear-facing gun for defense, and it had to fly low to drop its bombs accurately, which meant flying directly into the teeth of German anti-aircraft guns and Messerschmitt fighters. The crews knew this. They flew anyway. On the morning of May 12th, 5 Fairey Battles took off toward the Maastricht bridges. Within minutes, they were torn apart by German flak and Bf-109s. Not a single aircraft returned. Every crew was either killed or captured.
The mission did achieve something. 2 Victoria Crosses were awarded that day, both posthumously. But the bridges were not destroyed. The sacrifice was real. The tactical result was almost nothing. Over the course of the Battle of France, Fairey Battle squadrons suffered losses that are almost incomprehensible to modern minds. Some estimates suggest loss rates of over 50% per mission. That's not over a week or a month. Per mission. Pilots flew knowing the odds were roughly even that they wouldn't come back. They climbed in anyway. That's the part that stays with you. The Fairey Battle was withdrawn from frontline bomber duties by the end of 1940.
By then, hundreds of men had been lost in an aircraft that should never have been sent into combat against a modern air force. 4. The Heinkel He 177 Now let's cross to the other side. The Germans had their own mechanical nightmares, and few were as notorious as the Heinkel He 177, the Greif, which means Griffin, a mythical beast. An appropriate name, it turns out, because the He 177 seemed just as likely to kill you as carry you. Germany desperately needed a heavy long-range bomber. The He 177 was the answer. On paper, an impressive machine. Long-range, capable of high altitude, able to carry a significant bomb load. The problem was its engines. In a bizarre design decision, the He 177 used coupled engines, 2 separate engines driving a single propeller shaft on each wing. This was meant to reduce drag by presenting a narrow engine profile, in theory. In practice, these coupled engines had a catastrophic overheating problem. They caught fire, spontaneously, in flight. Not occasionally, routinely. Luftwaffe crews took to calling the He 177 the rice lighter, the Empire's cigarette lighter, because if you flew it long enough, it would ignite. Mechanics poured oil on the cowlings before missions to try to reduce friction, to try to prevent the inevitable. It rarely worked. Pilots would be hours into a mission over open sea or enemy territory when smoke would start trailing from the engine nacelles. What followed was often a desperate, terrifying attempt to reach land before the plane became a fireball. Hundreds of He 177s were destroyed, not by enemy action, but by their own engines catching fire. Entire crews burned alive over the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Eastern Front. Engineers worked on the problem throughout the war. They never fully solved it. The He 177 continued to fly, continued to burn, right until the end. It was the bomber that Germany needed, and the bomber that Germany could never make safe enough to trust. 5. The Messerschmitt Me 210. While we're on the subject of German failures, the Me 210 deserves its moment in the darkness. It was meant to replace the Me 110 heavy fighter, itself no longer competitive by mid-war. The Me 210 would be faster, more capable, better armed. Messerschmitt promised the Luftwaffe something special. What they delivered was a plane with such vicious handling characteristics that it was killing test pilots before it ever reached frontline squadrons. The Me 210's center of gravity was wrong. Its automatic leading-edge slats were unreliable. It had a brutal tendency to snap into a spin during tight maneuvers, the kind of maneuvers that are utterly routine in aerial combat. Pilots who pushed it too hard found themselves in an uncontrolled spin with almost no ability to recover. More than 100 Me 210s were lost in accidents before the type was even officially declared operational. The Reichsluftfahrtministerium, the German Air Ministry, was furious. There were formal inquiries, heads rolled politically speaking. Messerschmitt rushed out corrections, a lengthened fuselage, redesigned tail surfaces. Eventually, it became the Me 410, a reasonably capable aircraft. But the 210 itself remained, in the words of one test pilot, an aircraft that wanted to die. 6. The deadliest TBD Devastator. Back to the Pacific, and perhaps the most heartbreaking story of this entire video. June 4th, 1942, the Battle of Midway, one of the most decisive naval battles in history. And at the center of it, a moment of almost unbearable sacrifice. Torpedo Squadron 8, flying Douglas TBD Devastators, is ordered to attack the Japanese carrier fleet. The Devastator had been cutting edge in 1937. By 1942, it was obsolete. It was slow, particularly slow when carrying a torpedo, barely managing 115 miles per hour at low altitude. Its torpedo drop required the pilot to fly straight and level, at low altitude, at low speed, directly towards its target. In 1937, maybe you survive that. Against Japanese Zero fighters and shipboard anti-aircraft guns in 1942, you do not survive that. Torpedo Squadron 8 launched their attack. 15 Devastators went in. There were no fighter escorts, a catastrophic coordination failure on the American side. The Zeros were waiting. In minutes, 14 of the 15 aircraft were shot down. 44 men from the squadron were lost. One man survived, Ensign George Gay, who floated in the water on a seat cushion, watching the rest of the battle unfold around him. The Devastator's torpedoes, it later emerged, were also largely faulty, a separate scandal. Of the torpedoes that did reach their targets, most failed to detonate. The men of Torpedo Squadron 8 died for almost nothing, flying an aircraft that was already outdated, carrying weapons that didn't work, sent in without protection. The Devastator was retired from combat immediately after Midway, but no retirement notice could change what happened on that morning.
7. Heinkel He 162 Salamander. Germany, 1944. The Allies are coming and Hitler has a plan. Build a jet fighter, fast enough to tear through bomber formations. And to fly it, hand the controls to teenagers, Hitler Youth boys, with the bare minimum of training. They called it the Heinkel He 162 Salamander, the People's Fighter. Heinkel's design wasn't even the best proposal on the table, but it won because it was the easiest to mass produce. A third of the airframe? Plywood, a non-strategic material, they called it. Translation, we're running out of everything, so we're building warplanes out of wood. The prototype flew, and then it didn't. The wing disintegrated mid-flight, defective bonding in the plywood. The wooden frame warped in summer heat and turned brittle in winter cold. The plane was unstable in pitch, unstable in yaw, and if a pilot dared fly inverted for more than 3 seconds, the engine quit. The most experienced fighter pilots in the Luftwaffe flew it and came back with the same verdict.
8. Breda Botha 88. Italy, 1940, North Africa. Mussolini wanted a weapon that would make the world tremble. He got the Breda Botha 88 Lince, the Lynx. On paper, terrifying. It had set speed records before the war. The press called it one of the fastest twin-engine aircraft on Earth. The Italian Air Force was proud of this thing. Then they loaded it with weapons, with armor, with the actual equipment a warplane needs to fight. And the Lynx became a very expensive, very heavy brick. The aerodynamics, which had been just barely workable in its racing configuration, completely collapsed under the added weight. Pilots reported it was almost impossible to control at low speeds. Taking off was a gamble. Landing was a prayer. Flying in formation? Forget it.
When the Bat-88 was deployed over North Africa, a single combat mission was enough. The planes limped back, those that came back at all, with engines overheating, controls unresponsive, barely able to stay in the air. After just a handful of missions, the Italian Air Force grounded every single one. But here's the part that really stings. They couldn't even scrap them properly. The Italians left the Bat-88s sitting on Libyan airfields, useless. And to stop Allied forces from capturing working aircraft, they had nothing to worry about. There were no working aircraft to capture. They eventually used the empty hulks as decoys, fake planes parked on runways, hoping to fool enemy reconnaissance. The Lynx's greatest military contribution was pretending to exist.
There's a pattern in all of these stories. Engineers working faster than they could fully understand. Bureaucracies too proud to admit a failure. Commanders using what they had because there was nothing better, yet. And young men, most of them barely out of their teens, climbing into aircraft that the people who built them already knew were compromised. The Brewster Buffalo, the Blackburn Botha, the Fairey Battle, the He 177, the Me 210, the Devastator. None of these men were failures. The planes were failures. The men were extraordinary. They flew imperfect machines in the most dangerous skies in history. Some of them knew the odds and flew anyway. Some of them never had the chance to know. History remembers the great planes, the Spitfire, the Zero, the Mustang. It should also remember the ones that were asked to do the impossible in aircraft that made the impossible even harder.
If you liked this video, I'm sure you'll like this one too. Subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Our channel is small, so we are replying every comment below. Comment any suggestion for future videos. Thanks for watching.